Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today we are very happy to have Sarah Walker from UNSW. Some of you probably still remember Sarah. She visited us a couple of years ago. So she's applied microeconomist, focused on development, economic history, culture, and institution. She has very impressive records. I don't have to repeat that. So today she's going to share us with one of her recent research. And as you can see, the title here is The Power of Narratives, Anti-Black Attitudes and Violence in the US South. So again, the usual format, 75 minutes, including questions. And the floor is yours, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Simon. And thank you everyone for having me. It's a real honor to be here and to be sharing this work with you. It's joint work with my colleague, Federico Massera here at UNSW and Michele Rosenberg, who's at the University of Essex. And this is still very much a work in progress. So I really look forward to your thoughts and to your feedback. And please, at any moment, feel free to interrupt me. So the motivation for this paper comes from the observation that often when we observe instances of collective violence, this is often justified with a specific narrative. So for example, with the persecution of women in early modern Europe and the colonial United States, the excuse given for burning women at the stake were that they were witches. Throughout the horrific history of thousands of years of anti-Semitism, there have been several narratives to justify anti-Semitic violence, but one prevalent one that comes up a lot is that Jews steal money, for example. When we look at the United States, and particularly even in contemporary times, the stereotypes of minorities still prevail in the political and cultural discourse. So what we're doing in this paper is we're trying to understand the relationship between narratives and the demand for segregation and collective violence in the United States South over a period of 150 years. We're focusing specifically on a narrative that has been enduring in popular culture, which is a narrative that associates Black men with sexual predators. So here are just some examples over time of this narrative. Here's a propaganda pamphlet from 1865, right at the end of the Civil War, when Lincoln was reelected. This was a propaganda pamphlet that was spread to discuss the fears of miscegenation, meaning racial mixing. Here's a novel from 1938 that discusses the plot is the man Negro, the girl white, the payoff lynch. And perhaps more popularly or more recently, a book that we all have to read in the US, I think in high school, everybody has to read To Kill a Mockingbird, deals precisely with this issue. So the central plot is that a white woman makes an advance toward a Black man. Her father finds out and he forces her to claim that it was rape, and then a trial ensues. There's an attempted lynching, which is stopped by a young girl who's the daughter of the lawyer. So, this is a prevalent narrative in US culture, and we want to shed light on how it has prevailed. Something else that is an unfortunate reality in the United States is that, between the end of the Civil War and up until 1930, which is where the data stops, over 3,000 Black men were lynched. And when you look at the reasons given for these lynchings, in around 40% of the cases, the excuse given or the reason to justify the lynching was that a Black man had committed an alleged sexual offense against a white woman. And what we know from the historical literature, both in history and across the social sciences, is there's a long-standing hypothesis that one of the reasons for lynchings was that there was a fear of racial mixing. And so what we're going to do in this paper is show the long-term effect on the demand for segregation, collective violence, and racial attitudes of this narrative, how this narrative is used.
Sarah, can I have a quick query? So the narrative doesn't really include the sexual offense against a Black woman?
No, it does not.
Okay, got it.
It does not. I'm trying to go back here. Okay, it does not. So the way we're thinking about narratives comes from this theoretical work on narratives, which is that we as human beings, we use narratives as causal models. So we observe data around us and we make predictions using this data. And this allows us to map our actions into consequences and thus induces beliefs about the state of the world. So for example, in our, oh, you guys also read To Kill a Mockingbird, great. In our setting, we can think of the narrative model as the following. So after the Civil War in the United States South, you have the emancipation of the formerly enslaved. And at the same time, there are more interracial interactions, in particular between white women and Black men. And I'll show you some evidence of this later. So this is the data that people are working with. And the narrative that maps this data is that we find an association between Black freedom, in particular the freedom of Black men, and the loss of social order, the loss of the Southern social order. The prediction, or sort of the policy prescription of this narrative mapping, is that, well, we must restrict the interactions that we're observing in order to restore social order. And one of the beliefs that are cultivated in this setting to justify these restrictions is that Black men are sexual predators. So this is the mapping of the narrative that we're working with. How do we think narratives will affect racist beliefs and behaviors? Well, one way that narratives can affect racist beliefs and behaviors is that they function as a coordination device. So they allow you to coordinate the participation of people in acts of collective violence, and they coordinate social norms. You can also use narratives as psychological justification or to formulate motivated beliefs. So it justifies why you are committing violence against a group of people. And to the extent that narratives persist, there's a large literature on persistence in general, they can sustain collective violence and racist beliefs for long after the period in which we're sort of observing the data in the context that the narrative was built. So to think about this narrative and how salient it would have been after the Civil War, I just want to walk through a little bit of a history lesson. In the United States, there's a long tradition of racial separation. So the earliest anti-amalgamation law, or the earliest law restricting interracial marriages or relationships, was established in Maryland in 1664. And throughout, all the way up until the Civil War, many would claim that slavery, one of the benefits of slavery, was to guarantee the coexistence of the races by keeping them separate. Well, the Civil War happens and there's a new equilibrium. So there's a new political equilibrium, social equilibrium, economic equilibrium. And in this new equilibrium, it's been well documented by social scientists and historians that Black freedom, in particular, the Black freedom of men, the freedom of Black men, is perceived as a political threat. And in particular, racial mixing is seen as a threat to white supremacy. So what also happens in the context of the Civil War is that there's a huge demographic shock to the white population, namely white men. So 18% of white men of military age died during the Civil War, and the casualties were actually much higher in the South than they were in the North. And again, there's been a lot of documentation by historians about the extent to which this disrupts white domestic life. So for example, you have a generation of young women who are either widows or can't find partners on the marriage market. And also these women, in the absence of men, are taking on new economic enterprises. So in this context, we generate a few empirical predictions about how this narrative is cultivated and used to justify segregation and collective violence. So our hypothesis is that in places where white excess deaths were high as a result of the Civil War, there's a demand for segregation and collective violence, and an anti-Black narrative associating Black men with rape is cultivated in these places to justify segregation and collective violence. And so the way we estimate this is we exploit the randomness of excess deaths, which I'll show you are orthogonal to a lot of different things. And we then estimate the effect of this excess death on the demand for segregation, which we look at through shares, vote shares for the Democratic Party, which up until the 60s were actually the Conservative Party in the US. We also look at the prevalence of this narrative in newspapers. So through text-based analysis, we're able to look at how often the word Negro and rape are discussed in newspapers and how that correlates with the casualty shock. And then we also look at the impact on collective violence. So we have some data on lynchings. We also construct our own data set to complement the existing data, and we're able to observe the reason for the lynching. And we can look at lynchings that occurred for sexual allegations versus other type of lynchings like murder and assault and arson and other common reasons.
Quick question.
Sorry, may I have a question? Okay, go ahead, Tushar, sorry.
Thanks, Leandro. So I'm looking at the first bullet point, and this might be a trivial question, I might have missed it. What is the objective function here? Whose objective function are we looking at? And what's the utility from demanding segregation, right? Why?
Right, so the objective...
Sorry, my question is going the same line, so let me complement Tushar's question, so you don't have to answer twice. So I cannot follow the reason. I mean, why? I mean, I would say that where there are less men. So I mean, why this would mean needs to be more demand for segregation? I would say, I mean, naturally it would be the opposite. I mean, it would be where we would have more mixture marriages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are both good questions. So the objective function is the objective function is the white social planner who's trying to preserve their economic and political power. You are absolutely right that this is not what we would predict in a classic marriage market model. So actually you have a loss of men. Men are more likely to now they're scarce, so there's actually less competition on the marriage market. They should be able to find matches, right? And men are typically more violent. So if you have fewer men, why would we expect to see an increase in violence in these places? And our argument is that because of the threat of racial mixing, and we'll show you some evidence, this is what my last point down here about mechanisms is that in places where you have more missing white men, there's a relative increase in the number of white women to Black men, and white women then start having relationships with Black men or interacting with Black men. We'll show you some evidence of this. Racial mixing is perceived as a threat to the social order, to the political hierarchy. If you have mixed race children, they are now considered Black, and this has an effect on the future white voting bloc. And so there is a demand to separate the races so that you can prevent racial mixing. That's our central argument.
Can I ask a quick question? So are you essentially, if I take the perspective of a white father at the time of a daughter, I see your narrative. If I take the perspective of a white male who's 20 years old or so, then your story about competition in the marriage market grips, right? So it depends on what perspective I take.
Sure. Yeah.
And then it depends on who's in power. Well, probably the white father who's a bit older. Is that sort of along the lines that you're thinking?
Yeah, that is along the lines. That is along the lines that we're thinking. Mm-hmm.
Can I have a quick question?
Yeah.
So my understanding is, I'm sure you'll be discussing this in detail, but did I get this right? So you're saying that these excess deaths are orthogonal to maybe other factors, like maybe, you know, in the South you had a greater resistance during the Civil War, etc., and that may be kind of correlated with many other variables that can confound what you're talking about. So you're saying that you can show that excess deaths, maybe after controlling for a bunch of variables, was idiosyncratic,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. And I will show you more evidence of that in a minute.
I have a question also, Sarah.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that there was legislation right up to the 1960s in some states against racial intermarriage.
That is true.
Why not consider this as part of your evidence?
Well, we would love to consider that, but we don't have any variation in that.
Across states?
Yeah.
It's all the same?
I mean, yeah, I mean, those laws were struck down in the 1960s by the Supreme Court ruling on Loving versus Virginia, but most states in the South maintained their they call them anti-miscegenation laws up until the Supreme Court ruling. And really where most of our variation is coming from is the county level. So we want to be able to exploit county level variation, which we don't have at the legal level. So we'll show you evidence, for example, on voting behavior, which we can extrapolate to the county level based on congressional districts or voting districts, which, you know, is evidence for the legal demand for segregation, including relationships. So we contribute to several literatures. There's a budding literature on narratives in economics. Much of it is theoretical, discussing the theoretical role of narratives and how they map our data into actions and formulate beliefs. There's a literature on propaganda, sort of the supply of information and how that can lead to collective violence. There's also budding literature on newspapers and social media, sort of the demand for information. But what we're doing here is showing how narratives are formed and how they persist and how they can be used to justify collective violence. This relates to the literature on historical persistence. So this is a large literature, historical persistence in conflict. We know that conflict and persecution persist. We know a lot less about the mechanisms. So our work can speak to one of the mechanisms being narratives. We relate to a large and rich literature in sociology, mostly, and a little bit in economics, about the determinants for racial discrimination and in particular lynchings. So Tolnay and Beck are two sociologists who have worked extensively on lynchings and have collected some of the data on lynchings that we will use and have put forward several hypotheses for why lynchings occurred. The main explanation that has been put forward is economic competition between white men and Black men, political suppression. So there's been a lot of work to show that lynchings happened in order to prevent Black men from voting. There have been discussions of the psychosexual motivations to explicitly prevent white women and Black men from marrying or having sexual relationships. There's less empirical evidence on that, so we're speaking sort of directly to this hypothesis. We also relate to the work on demographic shocks and social norms and how demographic shocks can affect gender norms and also preferences over racial preferences. So let me walk you through the data that we're going to use. So first, looking at the outcomes that we'll explore, we have data on voting behavior in presidential elections from ICPSR. We have this from 1832 to 1968, and we can look specifically at the vote share for the Democratic Party. So up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Democratic Party was actually the conservative party in the US, particularly in the South. And so this, we argue, is a proxy for the demand for segregation. I'll get into more detail about that in a minute. We're also going to look at the prevalence of this narrative in newspapers. So we have scraped newspaper data from 1860 to 1900, and we look at the frequency of the word Negro and rape in the same issue, and we can count the instances of this, which we then correlate with our shock. And then lastly, we'll look at lynching, which is an extreme expression of the demand for segregation, but also can be construed as the narrative in work because we're able to look at the reason that was given for the lynching. So we leverage existing lynching data that Tolnay and Beck have put together from 1882 to 1930 for 10 Southern states. We complement that with the data that we collected ourselves by hand by looking through newspaper articles and hand coding instances of lynchings from 1865 to 1881 for all border and Confederate states, which we see as a contribution to the public good because we actually don't have any empirical evidence, any robust empirical evidence on lynchings during this period, which are arguably a really important period to examine because after the Civil War, lots of things were happening in terms of Reconstruction and race relations. So to show you, just to give you a little flavor of how we are measuring the narrative, the use of the narrative in newspapers, we have written a Python program that scrapes newspapers.com, which is a large database of newspapers in the United States. And we look for articles where the word Negro and the word rape were mentioned together. Here's an example from South Carolina in 1890. So we count the location of this article and the number of times these words are used together in every year. And when you look at this data over time, you can see that, right after the Civil War, this narrative starts to come about, and you can see persistence over time. When we are hand collecting our data on lynchings, what we have done is systematically search newspapers for reportings of lynchings. Here's an example of one that we found that was reported in the Camden Journal in South Carolina in 1868, but it's actually reporting a lynching that occurred in Georgia in Jefferson County, and it relates to lynching for the alleged rape of a white woman by a Black man. When we look at lynchings over time, when we combine our hand collected data with the existing data, we see the following trend. So first of all, you see lynchings start to rise after the Civil War. They peak around the early 1890s. And what's really interesting to me just about this time series is that the Supreme Court ruling on Plessy versus Ferguson happened in 1896, and that's what solidified the separate but equal mandate in the US and solidified constitutionally segregation. And what you start to see sort of after Plessy versus Ferguson is this sharp decline in lynchings. The other thing that's really interesting is when we look just at lynchings where a sexual offense was claimed, you can see that right after the Civil War and all the way pretty much through Reconstruction, which ended in 1877, it tracks very closely to total lynchings. And when you look over the whole series of time, 40% of lynchings occurred for an alleged sexual offense. Yes, Michael.
So is it the universe of newspapers or is it a sample?
It is. Yeah. So it is not, it is the universe as much as newspapers.com allows it to be. So that newspapers.com is considered to be the best depository of newspapers. But is there,
sorry, I was interrupting you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it's a sample. It's just what has been digitized so far.
So what about the following scenario? I'm a very progressive person who is tasked with digging out the past articles of my county. And I pick systematically those that mention those words, as opposed in another county, that person who, I'm making up a scenario now, but in another county where somebody is not that progressive and selects them equally. So selects a sample out of all 20%, but they're randomly, not systematically selecting those that mention those words. Is that an issue potentially?
I mean, potentially yes, but the primary reason newspapers.com came about is that it's actually owned by ancestry.com. So it's actually, most people use it for genealogical purposes to look at birth records and marriage records and things like that. So I would argue that the main function of newspapers.com is not, doesn't have a social or political slant. It's for trying to find your ancestors.
Yeah, but I'm guessing that's a question that would come up quite a bit. Like, you may do that in the paper, but I'd really try to cover your bases there. If there's a selection and a suspicion of selection, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, well, so what we can do is we have Genskow and Shapiro have mapped the full universe of papers. And I don't know, my co-author, Michele, is the one who's really focused on the newspaper analysis, but he would probably be able to tell you how many papers were missing from that universe.
Okay.
The other thing you'll see is that we're able to identify the political affiliation of the newspaper. So we know a lot of newspapers in this time had a political affiliation. They were either Republican or Democrat newspapers, self-stated. And we can look at differentiation between, is this a Democrat newspaper? Is this a or a non-Democrat newspaper? And how does the narrative differ with the type of newspaper? So we have variation as well.
Can you also, what was I going to say? No, I forgot what I was going to say. The other thing was, so you identify the articles that mention Negro and rape. Is there, like, at the time was rape the word that was always used, even though it was, even though it was sexual harassment, but not rape? I mean, that's inappropriately formulated, but I hope you understand where
yeah. I'm not offended.
Sorry.
We in our, what we're calling rape, what we're actually counting are rape, raping, raped, rapes. Outrage is a word that they used a lot. So we include outrage in our count of that. Assault.
So you capture all that too.
We can capture, yeah.
Okay, and last question. At the time, was it also that you had one national news agencies and smaller ones were just taking stories from them, or what? That was not that time, right? Like everybody had their own local stories.
Everybody had their local daily paper. I mean, you do have large papers like the Chicago Tribune, and you'll often see that when we pick up, for example, with the lynchings, because I hand-coded a lot of these myself, you'll see that the lynchings are reported not only, sometimes not even in the newspaper where they occurred, they're reported in the Chicago Tribune or some other newspaper, but the majority of news was at a very local level.
Okay, thanks.
Tushar, and then Leandro, I think.
Thank you. So I'm going to say something horribly politically incorrect, but I hope nobody gets offended. But I want to be very careful in the way I say it. So what you showed was the race-gender ratio was changing during this time, right? Because of the deaths, because of a lot of different factors. So there's a mechanical pathway through which more rapes will be committed by the category in question, right? Because their representation as a part of the entire population is increasing. So to what extent the narratives could actually be correlated with the underlying truth?
Well, again, I would push back and say that it's not clear to me that we should observe more rapes because men, white and black, have an advantage on the marriage market. There's a less competition. It shouldn't be hard for them to find a woman. They don't have to force a woman to be with them.
But if suppose you assume that there are a fixed percentage of men who engage in such acts, and the number of white men relatively is decreasing because more are dying. So relatively, the number of such criminals from the other group would increase, no? So say there were 10 in each that were criminals, right? That would do something like this.
Right.
Seven of the white ones got killed in the war, and 3 of the black criminals got killed in the war, right? So now in the population, you have a higher proportion of criminals from the black category,
right,
left behind. And so that could actually change what's happening in reality. And perhaps the narratives that's coming up in the newspaper is a reflection of that.
I see what you're saying. So maybe maybe the number of rapes doesn't change, but the profile of the rapist has changed proportionally.
Number could have gone down even, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think about that more carefully, but
actually, this, along with that, it stacks the deck against what you find, because if there are a lot fewer men, you'd expect, like what you mentioned earlier, Sarah, you'd expect fewer rapes, everything else equal. So that goes against what you said.
Yeah. There should be fewer and
if
anything, there should be fewer by that argument, and you find more. So it's kind of you estimate profound.
Yeah.
Well, one argument could be that there are less men, and perhaps men play a role of not only criminals but also in that setting, perhaps protection, right? Police force, or civil. I don't know how to put it, but like the number of women is also increasing relatively. So potential victim pool relatively.
Well, yeah, I would argue that is the narrative. That is the narrative that's being used. Okay, now we have all these vulnerable white women, and we have to protect them.
But the question is it the narrative, or could there also be an element of truth?
I think it's
the changing
unlikely
ratios.
given the propensity for men to commit violence, and there are fewer of them, and the incentives on the marriage market. I think it's unlikely.
Okay.
Yeah. Leandro.
I mean, I was just wondering, for this alleged sexual offense for reasons for lynchings. I mean, this just, doesn't have to be true, right?
Exactly.
In the sense that the guy just alleged. So in fact, might not be any bear with reality the number of actual rapes and why the guy was killed, right? But I was wondering, if the guy is gonna be killed anyway, you could allege anything.
Yes.
So I don't know to what extent this. I'm afraid, for example, the other reasons to link. The guy would die anyway. Doesn't matter what is the reason.
Sure.
So why this? I'm not sure if this alleged sexual offense is not correlated with the other offense.
I will show you evidence that it's not. So I will show you, we only find a correlation with the alleged for lynchings that occur for alleged sexual reasons. We don't find any effect on non-sexual lynchings. So we take this as evidence as the narrative is being used in these places. So we're not looking at the total incident of violence. We're looking at the reason that was given in the context of the violence.
I see.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna start moving because we're gonna, I think, run out of time. So let me tell you a little bit about the main variation that we're using. So we're talking about Civil War casualties. To understand how conscription worked in the Confederate Army, in 1861, the Confederate Army put out a call for 500,000 volunteers, but they could not meet those demands. So they instituted 3 conscription acts between 1862 and 1864. Overwhelmingly, these were overwhelmingly white men, usually poor white men, because there were exemptions for large slave owners and technical occupations. So if you worked on the river or in other technical occupations, you could get out of the conscription. If you owned more than 20 slaves, you could get out of conscription, or if you were wealthy enough, you could hire a substitute, but they shut that down in 1863. Unlike the Union Army, the Confederate Army does not have great records on both enlistment or deaths, in particular on deaths. There have been methods used by historians to estimate Confederate deaths. David Hacker is the main guy who does this, and his best estimates suggest that over 300,000 men died in the Confederate Army, and that 2/3 of these were actually from non-combat causes, so they were exposure to disease, basically. What's good for us in terms of identification is that most of the battles did not happen in the South. They happened right up at the border in Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Southern Pennsylvania, and there were very few civilian, almost no civilian casualties, and also very few Black casualties as well. So we're really exploiting a race-based demographic shock here to the white sex ratio. So because we don't have Confederate records, we don't actually use the given casualties. We draw on the method by David Hacker, and we estimate Civil War excess deaths by changes in the white sex ratio, looking at cohorts of young people using full count census data from 1860 to 1870. And so we look at, when you look at the spatial distribution of these white excess deaths, which we proxy for with changes in the white sex ratio, between the ages of 15 and 34, between 1860 and 1870, you can see there's a lot of variation throughout the South. So yes, they're concentrated in the deeper South, but within states, which is where our main variation is going to come from, there's also a lot of variation. So our empirical strategy is that we're leveraging the change in the white sex ratio for people who were of the age of conscription in 1860 versus 1870. And I will show you that this change is orthogonal to a lot of pre-war characteristics that could affect lynchings, for example. It's also balanced in earlier decades. So we don't see a pre-trend that in the places where the shock was higher, that they had a higher sex ratio in periods prior to the war. So here's our balance of covariates. You can see that for most things that we might be concerned about, like wealth, population, we look at the Gini index of slave owners because slaves were a primary form of wealth. This is real estate wealth. Racial mixing, so the instance of a white woman with a Black child, male labor force participation, the suitability of cotton production relative to wheat, which Michele and Fede have another paper showing that this corresponds to racial preferences over time, distance to the battlefield, the number of Confederate enlistments, whether there was a newspaper. These are all orthogonal to our shock. The only thing that isn't is that the shock was higher in places where there were more slaves, the shock is higher in places where there were fewer slaves. And this is not surprising given the fact that conscription, you could get out of fighting if you had a lot of slaves. So we're going to control for the percent of slaves in all of our estimations. If anything, this actually works to our advantage to the extent that there is a large literature in political science that showing that slavery corresponds to racist preferences. We have an underestimate of that, given that our shock is negatively correlated with slavery, but we're going to control for it. Here we do an event study just to show that prior to the war, there's no pre-trend in the sex ratio. After the war, places that had a big shock have a higher white female to male sex ratio, and it starts to dissipate over time. By 1900, it's back to parity in these places. So we are going to look at the impact of these excess white deaths on the demand for segregation, which we look at by the Democrat vote share. I have a different date range. I'm looking at 1832 to 1968. Also, the prevalence of the narrative in newspapers. We're going to look at lynchings for alleged sexual offenses and also non-sexual offenses. And then we'll also look at persistence in the current period. So we have data on contemporary racial attitudes in the South, which we will correlate with our shock. So our estimation strategy, we have two types of estimation strategies depending on the availability of data. So in time periods where we have pre-war observations, we're doing an event study where we interact the excess deaths or the change in the white sex ratio with time dummies. We can look at pre-trends, and we also include a county fixed effect, a year fixed effect, and we have pre-war covariates, which we interact with the year fixed effects, namely the percent enslaved in 1860, and we'll cluster standard errors at the county level. For data that we have no pre-war observations, we're looking at a cross-sectional, a panel estimation, but we can't look at pre-trends. So we are just regressing our outcome on the county level shock, controlling for 1860 pre-war covariates, which we interact with year fixed effects. And we include a state fixed effect, a year fixed effect, and cluster standard errors at the state year level. So first, let's look at the impact of excess white deaths on the demand for segregation. We're looking in particular at the vote share for the Democratic Party. It's important to know that at this point in time, the Democratic Party was the racist party. So in the pre-war period, the Democrats were staunchly opposed to abolition. And in the South, they're the ones who led the movement to secede from the Union in 1861. In the postbellum period, after the Civil War, the Southern Democrats were the larger proponents of Jim Crow legislation. So you've heard of the Dixiecrats. This is who the Democratic Party is in the Jim Crow era. In the mid-1900s, there starts to be a break of Southern Democrats from Northern Democrats. This is initiated around 1948 when President Truman, who was a Northern Democrat, he introduces a civil rights legislation at the Democratic Convention. And Northern Democrats follow by introducing their own pro-civil rights platform. This spurs Southern Democrats to walk out of the Democratic Convention, and political scientists have studied this phenomenon and show that by 1964, Democrats had officially lost the South. So we expect to see, if there is a demand for segregation, we expect our shock to roughly follow this trajectory of the Democratic Party platform. And indeed, what we find looking at this is, again, this is vote share in presidential elections for the Democratic Party. Just before the war, we have a no pre-trend from 1832 to 1860. We drop the period of the war and Reconstruction, actually, because Democrats were disenfranchised during Reconstruction, and it wasn't until about 1877 that they were able to participate in politics again in the South. And so you find that in later periods after the war, counties where the excess death shock or the sex ratio shock is highest has a sustained support for the Democratic Party. And around the 50s, you start to see this turn, such by 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was ratified, you have a reversal of this trend, right? So there's negative support for the Democratic Party. When we look at the effect of our shock on the narratives in the newspapers, again, we're counting the instances of Negro and rape in newspapers prior to the war. There's no pre-trend. We separate our newspapers into Democrat papers and Republican papers, as Genskow and Shapiro have classified them. And you can see that after the war, in places where the shock was higher, the change in the sex ratio is higher, you see an increase in the use of this narrative that persists over time in Democrat papers, importantly.
But they are not statistically different from the Republicans.
They are not statistically significant. Well, yeah, they start to be. But that's not what we're comparing, actually. We're comparing it to themselves. So this is an event study. We're not comparing Democrat versus Republican. We're comparing Democrat papers before and after the war in places where the shock was higher. So relative to their narrative, their use of the narrative before the war, they increased the use of the narrative in these places where the shock was bigger. So then we look at the belief that Black men are rapists, which we proxy for with these sexual lynchings. So what we find is that for a standard deviation increase in the white sex ratio, there's a 35% increase in the likelihood of a lynching for a sexual offense during Reconstruction. So this is the period where there was a lot of political turmoil after the war. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed to grant the newly emancipated significant political, economic, and social rights. But even after Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow era, we still see an effect of our sex ratio shock on lynchings for a sexual excuse. So a standard deviation increase in the white sex ratio increases the likelihood of a sexual lynching by 9.5%. This is robust to all sorts of controls, war controls, whether the county had federal occupation, slavery, Gini index of slave owners, relative suitability of cotton to wheat, and the distance to the north. What we also find is there's no correlation with non-sexual lynching. So Leandro, this gets to your point where we're not measuring an increase in violence. We're measuring an increase in violence using this narrative. So the narrative is justifying the use of violence in these places, but we don't see any correlation with lynchings for other excuses like murder or arson or theft. There's a question, Juan.
Hi, Sarah. Sorry for interrupting. I was just looking at the specification. I noticed that, as you said, it's an event study approach, and I noticed that you're using state fixed effects instead of the traditional two-way fixed effects and including.
No. So this is not an event study analysis because we don't have pre-war data on lynchings. Lynchings didn't occur during slavery. So our other newspaper and vote share includes county fixed effect. So it's a two-way fixed effect. This is not. This is just a panel analysis using state fixed effects because we don't have pre-trend data.
Got it. Thanks.
Yep. Yes, Tushar.
Sorry again. I'm slightly confused. I want to get some clarity. So the story here is that these narratives change the beliefs in such a short time. And then the new beliefs persist for a very long time, right? Which to me seems like a bit contradictory in itself, that beliefs are difficult to move in the first place, but suppose you move them in such a short period, then why does the new information not revise them back to, the reality?
What is the new information?
Which is basically, so over time, it'll become clear. So as you said, that the reality might not be that, rapes are actually increasing or sexual assaults are increasing. So narratives versus reality, the reality gets revealed to you over time, right? That's how you update your beliefs. So the reality is getting revealed every day from lived experience. So why is that not changing the beliefs back to what they should be?
Mm-hmm. So one reason is that narratives persist. I mean, we have a lot of evidence that beliefs persist. I'll show you some further evidence that the data that people are seeing around them actually never goes away. So we see persistent racial mixing in these places. And I'll show you some evidence of that. Yeah.
I think another explanation is also that perhaps I am a racist, but I can't really articulate it, and it's not okay to say or to act that way. But with these articles coming out, it gives me an excuse to act that way. And there was, of course, I forgot the name, but there was a recent great paper that actually said this. Like one reason it racist narrative, it just brings out, it makes the racists more comfortable in being racist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm explaining very badly, and I forgot where the paper was. Maybe I'll find it.
Motivated beliefs and the psychological justification. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the actual beliefs may not change, but it makes it more acceptable to state my beliefs.
Mm-hmm. And the narrative persists as well. So the media you're consuming is telling you this as well.
Yeah, and they're telling me it's okay to say racist things and to act racist.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael.
Michael, are you referring to scapegoating during crisis?
It may have been that one. Yeah, could be.
I think, yeah, because that article
Yep.
discusses that, Sarah, scapegoating during crisis. I think that was by Leonardo Berzentine, Christopher Roth, and others.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the one.
Okay. I'm sure my co-authors know it, but let me write it down. Okay, so mechanisms. Actually, your questions are leading right to here. So we look at the impact of excess deaths on other outcomes. First, I won't have time to show you today, but what we do observe is there is obviously a shift in the white marriage market. So you have more, after the war, you have more white women who are unmarried or never married. You have fewer white men who are unmarried or never married because they can easily find a match. You also have more white women with children out of wedlock. So they're unmarried women, but they're having children. We find also that women increase their participation in the labor force. So this speaks to our argument that even if interracial relationships are or are not happening, there's just an increase in the observability of white women being outside of their homes, and now they're interacting with Black men, maybe even in platonic ways, but this can also be seen as a threat. What I will show you is we also have evidence of racial mixing. So again, it was noted that anti-miscegenation laws were on the books in the US all the way up until the 1960s. So it was illegal for white women and Black men, or white men and Black women, to be married. So we can't really observe marriages, but what we can, and there would be an incentive in the census to underreport cohabitation or even a relationship. What we can observe in the census are white women who have a Black child that they've reported as their child in the census. And we take this as our best estimate of racial mixing in this context. And what we find is that, again, prior to the war, there's no pre-trend, but after the war, there is an increase in these places where the shock to the white sex ratio was higher. You see a sustained impact on racial mixing. So you see for decades later, there's higher racial mixing in these places. What we also find is that this narrative persists. So I already showed you in the newspaper analysis that the narrative itself persists in the newspapers. But what we also find is that in periods of economic hardship, which we take as shocks to the cotton market, so in places that produce cotton, if we interact that suitability for producing cotton with the sex ratio shock, what we find is, and cotton prices, so when cotton prices fall, in places where they produce cotton, they have a higher suitability for producing cotton, and the sex ratio shock was higher, you see an increase in the use of this sexual offense narrative to justify the lynchings. I'm not going to show you those results today. What I will show you is that we look at contemporary racial attitudes today and find that in places that had this shock after the Civil War, you still see a persistent effect on racial attitudes among white people today. The way that we measure this is we take data from Harvard's implicit association test from the years 2015 to 2019. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the implicit association test, but it is a computer-based test. So full disclosure, it's not a random sample. Often what happens is people are taking a course and their professor says, go online and see how implicitly racist you are. Or people hear about the test and they log online to do the test. So it's not a random sample of the population, but what it does measure in a computer-based setting is it shows you pictures of good or bad, and it asks you to make associations between certain concepts like race or gender, or various stereotypes, athletic and clumsy. And so you look at the screen and a picture of a white person and a Black person comes on, and they have a prompt that says good or bad, and you have to categorize who belongs to what, and it measures how quickly you respond. There's been a lot of criticism of these tests. Some people feel like they don't measure anything. Some people feel like you can game them. What's interesting to our situation is, in addition to these implicit measures, they also ask a random subset of explicit questions that respondents can answer. And so we look at explicit questions that are related to the narrative, to the sexual predator narrative. So for example, do Black people tend to be violence prone? When interacting with Black people, I feel, for example, worried. It would not bother me if my new roommate was Black. I would probably feel somewhat self-conscious dancing with a Black person in a public place. I would be willing to have a sexual relationship with a Black person. So we look at both the implicit score, but also these explicit answers. Again, we can't do this in an event study framework. This is just a panel. But what we find when we correlate the shock is that there's no correlation with the implicit measure. This could be just because those measures are noisy, but what we do find is a correlation with the explicit measures, so the stated preferences of these people. So in places where the sex ratio shock was higher, they're more likely to have a violent perception of Black people. They're more likely to, these are for white respondents only, they're more likely to feel worried around Black people, less willing to have a Black roommate, more likely to feel uncomfortable around Black people, less willing to have a sexual relationship with a Black person. Then we break it out by gender to see if there are differences between white men and white women. These coefficients are standardized to mean 0, standard deviation 1. So what we can interpret for the female coefficient is that in the average county where the average sex ratio shock occurred, women have a less bias, implicit bias toward Black people. They're less likely to feel worried around Black people. They're less likely to feel than men to feel uncomfortable dancing or having a sexual relationship with a Black person. But what's also interesting is that when we look at the interaction between the shock and women, in places where the shock was higher, white women are also less likely than men to have a violent perception of Black people. So we look at lots of different additional mechanisms. We do lots of different robustness tests, which I don't think I will have time to show you today. But you can think of several alternative mechanisms, right? There's a lot of different stories that you could tell in this context. For example, we control for spillover effects. So we look at lynchings in the previous year within a 100-kilometer radius of where one occurred. There's no spillover effect. They don't explain the results on lynchings. Something else we look at is, so systematically what would happen through this demographic shock is, now you have fewer white men, but you have relatively more Black men. And now Black men have the right to vote and they have the right to participate in the labor market. So this could be seen as direct economic and political competition. And maybe this is what is driving our results. And we do show that in places where the shock occurred, there's an increase in the ratio of Black to white men, and there's also an increase in their relative income. So Black men are relatively better off than white men right after the war. When we control for these outcomes, they don't affect our main results. Something else you might be worried is that maybe this is just backlash from the war. You know, you had a bunch of men die, and maybe what we're just picking up is animosity about the war. So we control for different factors related to the war, like distance to the Mason-Dixon line, the number of the per capita Confederate enlistments in that county, whether there was a refugee camp for the emancipated slaves in that county, whether that county was occupied by the Union Army during Reconstruction. When we control for all these war-related outcomes, there's no impact on our results. Something else that I think is interesting is that, you know, to get at, was there more crime necessarily in these places, which I think are some of the questions that were coming up a little bit. We look at legal executions. So we find that there's no relationship to our shock and legal executions. And lastly, something people might be worried about is migration. So for example, if Northern men migrated to these places after the war to capitalize on increases in wages because of a scarcity of men in the labor market. Northern men were potentially, you know, they were seen as like scalawags, that was the name they were called, and they were mostly Republicans. You might also be worried that there was Black migration into these places, and that's what's driving the results. When we look at changes in the population, when we look at migration, we find, if anything, there's less white migration into these places and there's less Black interstate migration. We also find that excess deaths are negatively correlated with the refugee camps. So it's not as if you have Black men all of a sudden coming into these places and further driving the demand for violence. So yes, Michael.
There's an interesting parallel to Australia and this migration issue. And I have in mind the White Australia policy. I mean, we had the opposite. We had an influx of Pacific Island labour in Queensland. So there was a higher migrant labour force, and Australia reacted against that by introducing a white Australia policy to prevent the type of thing. So my question is, you're talking about interstate migration. Why do you think that the American federal government didn't consider something like that, a white America policy? I mean, if there's this narrative going through, it's a negative narrative, then you'd think, well, how do you respond to that? And they didn't do it through migration, through their international migration policy.
Well, I mean, they did in later years. There were anti-immigration parties that popped up in later years. Yeah. But I think at the time, the concern of the federal government, so right after the Civil War, the concern of the federal government, which was run by Northerners at the time, was to reconstruct the South. And so they placed troops there to try and prevent, you know, to make sure that Black men were getting to the polls, able to vote. They had a Freedmen's Bureau set up to help the newly emancipated find jobs, reconnect with their family members. So I think that in the years following the war, up until the 1877, the real effort was trying to repair the damage that had been done. The federal government was interested in trying to repair the damage that had been done. Southerners kind of balked at that, but they didn't have any power at the national level to fight, for example, for international migration.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, hello, sir. Thanks for sharing this interesting result. And it's good to know that in the end you show you have talked about the alternative mechanism of this labor market. That's a question or proposal I would like to ask. But you said you just control in your regressions this channel, but I'm thinking it might be better to look at interaction here, because here your explanation really focused on the marriage market, but there is another market, the labor market, but we know there interaction between the two. For example, now, okay, there is more opportunities for a Black man, but also at the same time more working opportunities for the job opportunities for the Black women, right? So I think both for a white women, okay, they become more financially independent. They have more bargaining power as well in the marriage market. And for the Black men, they have more economic power than before in the labor market. I think in that sense, the Black man is a victim in both markets, okay? So, but I think these marriage market issues could interact with this labor market. So I would say, okay, rather than control this economic labor market channel, maybe you can, it'll be interesting to know how they interact. And I think you can, for example, so by introducing some cross-region variation to see how this labor market change, because you can, for example, by looking at the difference in the economic structure, then we know for some industries, they can provide more jobs for the women. And for some industries, they provide more labor demanding and low skill job for the Black men. Then by looking at this regional variation, maybe you can see how the labor participation change, both for the Black men, Black women, white men, white women, and then you know how it happens in this labor market, and then you can say how it interact with the marriage market. I think that would be an interesting channel to me to know, rather than just control it.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So one thing is that, so for example, just to go back on something that you had said earlier, is that white women actually don't have the bargaining power on the marriage market because they're the surplus. So it's actually the scarce gender that has the bargaining power on the marriage market. So it's white men who have the bargaining power on the marriage market. It's true that white women might be earning independent incomes, but anyone that they're matching with, any man that they're matching with is going to be probably better off. But we could look, we do have the manufacturing surveys from the census, and we could look at the industries there and potentially look at interaction effects. Yeah. Michael.
Yeah, that's great projects and great idea. And I think you've done a whole lot of stuff in terms of robustness checks and whatnot. The one thought I had, and I could well be wrong because it's not my literature, but I almost find the reduced form more interesting than your X variable of racist narratives. Like, I know what you're focusing on racist narratives, but almost that conclusion that racist narratives breed racism it's interesting, but it's kind of not obvious, but yeah, I mean, I could have guessed that kind of. But what I'm almost a bit more surprised by is how war deaths have such consequences on racism, actually. So I wonder, and that is something you could replicate or you could test in a bunch of different settings. And if you find that male war deaths actually have these effects on in versus out group dynamics, xenophobia, racism, whatever it may be, and you find that consistently across time and space, I think that's almost a more interesting thing. But again, I don't know if those projects are out there already or if that's sort of common knowledge, but
they're not. And thank you for that comment, because one of the ideas that I've had is to try and look at this in the context of Europe between World War I and World War II, looking at Germany in particular, because there were anti-miscegenation laws in Germany, in Nazi Germany. The Nuremberg laws, had strict prohibition of marriage between Jews and Germans and non-Jewish Germans. So, I had started to look at that data like over a year ago, and there is a correlation. So if you look at places where the sex ratio changed in Germany between World War I and World War II, there is a correlation with Jewish persecution during the Holocaust.
Wow. Do you have county level data or municipality, or what's the data you have?
In Germany?
Yeah.
I don't remember. I got the data from someone. I don't remember.
Because we have that for another project we derived that, at least for a southern state, we have it at the municipality level, and we have vote shares before the Second World War and a bunch of different data. So if you want anything there, send me an email and I can send you what we have.
Cool.
Helps. But yeah, I think if you can show this in different settings, like forget the X variable for a second, but look at male war deaths and see whether that automatically predicts racism or xenophobia later on. I think that would be really
I think it's really interesting too. I think it's harder to do in those settings because, for example, in the US context, it's a really clean shock because it's really just white men who died. Whereas I think, for example, in Germany, Jewish men fought in the First World War and they were considered the scapegoat for the surrender of World War I. So, I mean, I don't know, I'm not sure if that confounds or if that just amplifies, but
I think less so. I think they were less so considered a scapegoat for World War I. There was more sort of the leftists and the politicians and the bureaucrats, if I remember that narrative correctly, not the Jewish people per se. And even Jewish men fought in World War I for Germany. I don't think it was that many. Like there's this anecdotal accounts here and there, or they even fought for Germany, but then they talk about these handful of people, which they may have been there, but I doubt it was a large share. I could be wrong, but that's sort of good because we read quite a bit about that time for that other project.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, I think that would be, to me, that would be even more attractive of a paper if you replicate this the Z. So if you just look at war deaths and then connect racism and xenophobia later on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting as well. So let's talk.
All right, thank you so much, and then thank you, Sarah, for hosting for me most of the time. Okay, all right. So, is there any more questions from the audience? You know, we agree that this. Oh, okay, Emmy, please.
Yes. Hi. Just I missed the point. Why was the Confederate Army mostly formed by white men and not black men?
Well, because black men were slaves when the war broke out, and the Confederate leaders thought they were lazy and that they would be bad soldiers. So they didn't allow them to fight because what they were fighting for was to keep those guys enslaved. So what ended up happening is a lot of black men, some black men defected to the North and ended up fighting in the Union Army.
Yes, I see. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so any more questions? If not, okay, well, let's thank Sarah for the fascinating work and the talk, and then hopefully we'll have a chance to invite you to visit us next time.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all of your questions. This has been really fruitful.
All right, thank you. All right, I'll end the meeting right now.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.